The night was quiet, too quiet for a city that would soon shake the world. In the shadows of Jerusalem, a storm was forming, not of thunder, but of betrayal. The man who healed the blind, calmed the seas, and forgave the broken, now stood on the edge of his destiny. The streets that once cheered his name now whispered his death. And as the moon rose high above the Mount of Olives, heaven held its breath. For the time had come. The crucifixion had begun, not with nails, but with a kiss. The wind moved softly through the olive trees that night. Jesus knelt on the cold ground, his hands trembling, his face pressed to the earth. The weight of the world, every sin, every pain, every heartbreak, rested heavy upon his shoulders. The disciples, exhausted from the long days of ministry, slept just a few steps away. They didn't understand what was about to happen. No one did. Jesus whispered into the darkness, his voice full of sorrow and strength, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will. Yours be done." It wasn't fear that filled him. It was love. Love deep enough to endure pain beyond measure. The kind of love that would face death for the sake of others. Far off, a flicker of light appeared. Torches. The sound of footsteps grew louder. The soldiers of Rome, guided by one of his own, were on their way. Judas, his disciple, his friend, walked ahead of them, leading them straight to the garden. His heart was torn, but his choice was made. The silver coins in his pocket were cold reminders of the price of betrayal. Jesus rose to his feet, his calm unshaken. He looked toward the approaching crowd and whispered to his followers, "The hour has come." Peter and John stirred from their sleep, confusion turning to panic. The clang of armor drew nearer. The night air grew heavy with fear. Judas approached, his eyes avoiding Jesus's. "Rabbi," he said softly and kissed him on the cheek. That kiss, gentle, yet deadly, was the signal. The soldiers stepped forward, chains glinting in the torchlight. Peter grabbed his sword, striking wildly, but Jesus stopped him. "Put your sword away," he said. "For those who live by the sword will die by the sword." Even in betrayal, he showed mercy. He reached out and healed the ear of the wounded soldier, his last miracle before the cross. The disciples scattered into the night. Fear took them, just as the prophecy said it would. Alone, Jesus stood surrounded by soldiers. His wrists were bound, but his spirit was free. They dragged him toward the city, torches lighting the path of suffering. Behind them, the garden fell silent once more, the place where love surrendered to destiny. As they led him through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, the people slept, unaware that the greatest story in history was unfolding beneath the same moon that watched over them. And in that quiet darkness, the first steps toward the cross had begun. The city of Jerusalem was still asleep, yet the temple courtyard burned with light. Torches flickered against stone walls as shadows moved quickly through the night. The priests had gathered, not for prayer, but for judgment. In the center stood Jesus, his hands tied, his robe torn, his face calm. Around him, men whispered lies, searching for reasons to destroy the truth standing before them. The high priest, Caiaphas, stared at him with cold eyes. "You have been called a blasphemer, a false prophet," he said. "You claim to be the Son of God. What do you say to these things?" But Jesus said nothing. His silence was louder than any defense. It wasn't fear, it was purpose. He knew the words of Isaiah were unfolding that very night. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. The crowd grew restless. They wanted anger. They wanted rebellion. But all they saw was peace, a peace that frightened them because it was divine. False witnesses stepped forward, their voices trembling. He said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. One shouted. Another added, "He calls himself the king." The priests murmured, twisting truth into accusation. Every lie was another stone thrown at innocence. Yet Jesus stood still, his eyes soft, his heart unbroken. He was not fighting for his freedom. He was surrendering for ours. Then Caiaphas stepped closer, his voice rising. "I adjure you by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." The silence broke. Jesus lifted his head and spoke with a steady voice that filled the chamber. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The room erupted. Caiaphas tore his robe, shouting, "Blasphemy! What further need do we have of witnesses?" The council roared with rage. Some spat on him, others struck his face. The soldiers blindfolded him, mocking, "Prophesy, Messiah! Who hit you?" Still, he did not answer. In that moment, heaven watched as justice was twisted by hate. Angels must have wept, but the plan of redemption was moving forward, one cruel step at a time. The Son of God was being judged by those he came to save. As dawn began to break over Jerusalem, they dragged him from the council chamber. The same sun that once shone on his miracles now rose over his suffering. Yet even as the world turned against him, his heart remained full of love. Love for the very ones who condemned him. The trial was over, but the verdict had already been written in eternity. The Lamb was found without blemish. The sacrifice was ready. And as the city awoke, the road to the cross stretched ahead, waiting for the footsteps of a Savior who would not turn back. The sky was fading from black to gray as dawn crept over Jerusalem. The night that began with betrayal was now ending with heartbreak. Outside the temple walls, a small fire burned in the courtyard, the only light in the cold morning air. Around it, guards and servants gathered, laughing, whispering, and watching the trial unfold from a distance. Among them sat Peter, the man who once swore he would die for Jesus. His heart pounded as he watched from the shadows. Every shout from the council cut deeper into his soul. Fear wrapped around him like chains. He remembered the garden, the arrest, the confusion, the moment he ran. Guilt burned in his chest, but so did hope that maybe, somehow, Jesus would escape. A young servant girl looked at him closely through the firelight. "You were with him," she said. Her voice was small, but her words carried like thunder. Peter froze. Every eye turned toward him. His throat tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, looking away. The girl frowned, uncertain, but said no more. He moved closer to the shadows, but another voice rose. "You are one of his followers. I've seen you with him." This time Peter's fear became anger. "I am not," he shouted. The words came out harsher than he meant, echoing in the quiet courtyard. He looked down, trembling, his heart breaking a little more. Then a third voice spoke. A man's voice, steady and sure. "Your accent gives you away. You're a Galilean. You were with Jesus." Peter's hands shook. His eyes darted toward the council hall where Jesus stood bound. In that moment, he broke. "I swear I don't know the man," he cried. And then, the sound. A rooster crowed. The morning air froze. Peter turned his head slowly toward the doorway. Jesus was being led through the courtyard, his face bruised, blood staining his robe. Their eyes met for just a second. One heartbeat of silence between them. Jesus said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes spoke everything. Pain, forgiveness, love. Peter stumbled backward, tears filling his eyes. The sound of the rooster echoed again as he ran into the empty streets. He fell against a stone wall, sobbing. "I failed you," he whispered into his hands. The city was waking up, unaware that one man's heart had shattered with the sunrise. The same sun that once shone on miracles now rose over despair. But even in his guilt, grace had already found him. Jesus knew this fall was not Peter's end. It was the beginning of his redemption. And as the light spread across Jerusalem, the world moved one step closer to the cross. The sun had barely risen when the shouting began. Jerusalem was awake now, restless, angry, confused. Crowds filled the narrow streets like waves crashing against stone. In the center of that storm stood Jesus, his hands bound, his body bruised from the night before. The priests led him through the mob, their faces twisted with pride and fear. Behind them, Roman soldiers pushed back the people, keeping order through violence. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and tension. They brought him before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, a man weary of rebellion, politics, and the endless cries for justice that never truly came. Pilate sat upon his marble seat, his eyes sharp and cold. but his heart uncertain. He looked at Jesus, not as a criminal but as a mystery. "What accusation do you bring against this man?" he asked the priests. "He claims to be a king," they replied, their voices trembling with fury. "He stirs the people, blasphemes our God, and threatens Caesar's throne." Pilate studied Jesus for a long moment. The silence between them was heavy. Finally, he spoke. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus raised his head. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate leaned back, his brow furrowed. He saw no rebellion in this man, no threat, only truth. Yet truth was dangerous in a world built on lies. The priests shouted louder, desperate to see blood. "He must die! He calls himself the Son of God." Pilate's wife sent a message from her chambers warning him. She had dreamed of this man, a dream of innocence, of suffering, of something divine. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man," her note said. Pilate hesitated. His conscience fought against the crowd's roar. He turned to Jesus once more. "Do you not hear the things they say against you?" But Jesus stood silent. Not one word. The silence broke Pilate's heart. He turned to the crowd. "I find no fault in him." But the mob shouted back, louder, crueler, angrier. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The noise rose like thunder. Pilate looked out and saw chaos. Priests stirring hatred, citizens crying for blood, and a man standing quietly in chains, his face peaceful amid the madness. In desperation, Pilate took a bowl of water. He washed his hands before them all and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." But no amount of water could cleanse the guilt that followed him. The soldiers moved forward. They stripped Jesus of his robe and wrapped him in mockery. A crown of thorns pressed onto his head, a reed placed in his hand like a false scepter. They laughed and bowed, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they struck him again and again. Through it all, he said nothing. His silence spoke of mercy, his wounds of love. And as the crowd's cries filled the air, the judgment of Rome was sealed, not by power, but by fear. The king had been condemned, and the road to Calvary had begun. The sound of chains echoed through the courtyard. Cold stone walls trapped the cries of pain inside, while outside, the city buzzed with ignorance. Life went on, but within those walls, heaven wept. The Son of God stood before a post, stripped, silent, and surrendered. The soldiers surrounded him, their faces hard, their hearts colder than the iron whips in their hands. The first lash struck. The air split with a sound that silenced every mocking laugh. Flesh tore, blood fell to the ground like rain. Yet Jesus did not cry out. He staggered but did not resist. Blow after blow came, each one sharper, crueler, more merciless than the last. The soldiers found amusement in his suffering, turning brutality into a game. They mocked him with words they didn't understand. "Where is your power now, King?" they sneered. The whip cut again. His back, once strong enough to carry the lost and the broken, was now torn open. Yet his strength remained, not in his body, but in his will. Every strike was a choice to love, to forgive, to endure. When they grew tired, the soldiers laughed and stepped back. One of them, filled with dark humor, picked up a branch from a thorn bush. "A crown for our king," he said. They twisted it into a cruel circle, each thorn sharp and thick. Without mercy, they pressed it onto his head. Blood ran down his face, mixing with sweat and dust. The soldiers knelt before him, mocking his kingship. "Hail, King of the Jews!" one shouted, bowing low in false worship. They spit on him, struck his face, and laughed as the blood splattered their armor. He looked at them, not with anger, but with sorrow. He could have stopped it all with a word, a breath, a thought, but love held him still. Each wound, each drop of blood was more than pain. It was purpose. This was not just punishment. It was prophecy being fulfilled. The Lamb of God was being prepared for the altar. Isaiah's words came alive in that moment. "By his stripes we are healed." When they were done, he was barely standing. The soldiers tossed a scarlet robe over his shoulders, a cruel mockery of royalty. The fabric stuck to his open wounds. They pushed him toward the door, laughing, unaware that the blood staining their hands was the same blood that could save them. As he stood beneath the pale morning light, his crown of thorns glinting red, he looked like no king the world had ever known. Yet he was the king of all creation. His silence was not weakness. It was victory in slow motion. The crowd outside waited, restless and loud. The sentence had been given. The cross awaited. And as the soldiers prepared to lead him through the streets, heaven whispered one truth. The king was not losing his throne. He was taking it. Through pain, through blood, through love. The streets of Jerusalem trembled under the weight of silence before the storm. Then came the sound. Wood scraping against stone, heavy footsteps, the sharp commands of soldiers. The cross had been brought out. Not smooth, not clean, but rough, splintered, and soaked in old blood. They placed it on his shoulders, the same shoulders that once carried the weak, the same arms that once lifted the lost. Jesus staggered beneath the crushing weight. Every step forward was agony. His back, torn and bleeding from the scourging, pressed against the coarse wood. Each movement sent fire through his body. Yet he walked, slow, steady, unbroken. The crowd gathered along the narrow path, their faces a mixture of pity, confusion, and hatred. Some jeered, others wept. Children clung to their mothers as soldiers shouted and pushed the crowd back. The road to Calvary, the Via Dolorosa, was steep and cruel. Dust rose with every step, mixing with blood that dripped from his brow. The crown of thorns cut deeper, its cruel edges digging into his flesh. Still he did not curse. Still he did not stop. He carried not just the cross, but the sins of every soul that would ever live. A woman in the crowd reached out, breaking through the line of soldiers. Her name was Veronica. With trembling hands, she wiped his face with a cloth, stained forever with his blood. For a moment the noise faded. The world seemed to pause as compassion met suffering. Then the soldiers pushed her away, their cruelty louder than mercy. Jesus fell. The sound of wood hitting stone echoed like thunder. The soldiers shouted for him to rise, but his body trembled from exhaustion. A soldier looked around and pointed to a man, Simon of Cyrene, a traveler caught in the chaos. "You! Help him carry it!" they barked. Simon hesitated, then stepped forward. Together they lifted the cross, two strangers bound by destiny, one carrying wood, the other carrying the world. The crowd moved again, climbing the hill toward Golgotha, the place of the skull. Some laughed, some turned away, unable to watch. His mother, Mary, stood in the distance, her heart breaking silently. Every step her son took was a dagger to her soul, but she didn't cry out. She knew this was the path foretold, the price of salvation. Blood, sweat, and dust mixed into holy ground beneath his feet. The very earth seemed to mourn, the sky dimming though the day was still young. With every stumble, with every gasp for air, he proved what love truly is. Not comfort, not safety, but sacrifice. At the top of the hill, the soldiers prepared the cross for the final act. The crowd's noise faded to a low hum as Jesus looked out over the city. The same city he had once healed, taught, and loved, now watched as its Savior prepared to die. And as the wind blew cold over the hill of Calvary, heaven whispered again, "The cross is not his defeat, it is his throne." The hill was silent now. The laughter had faded, the shouting had died, and only the wind remained, cold, restless, carrying the weight of heaven's sorrow. The soldiers laid the cross flat on the ground. Jesus looked at it for a moment, not as a tool of torture, but as the final step of love. Without resistance, he lay down upon it. His arms stretched wide, as if ready to embrace the world one last time. The hammer was raised. The sound that followed broke the earth. Thud, thud, thud. Each strike drove a nail through flesh and wood. Each echo a heartbeat of pain that rippled through creation. Blood flowed freely, yet his lips did not curse. Instead, he whispered through the agony, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The soldiers lifted the cross and dropped it into its place with a heavy crash. His body shook under the weight, but his spirit did not falter. Above his head, they nailed a sign, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." They mocked him even in death, but what they didn't know was that the title was true. At the foot of the cross stood his mother, her eyes filled with tears that refused to fall. Beside her, John held her trembling hand. Their silence spoke louder than any cry. Around them, the crowd stared. Some curious, some guilty, some broken. Others still sneered, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself." Yet they did not understand. It wasn't nails that held him there. It was love. Hours passed. The sky began to change. Clouds rolled in like a storm from heaven itself. The light dimmed, shadows crept across the land, and a strange stillness filled the air. The earth seemed to hold its breath, as creation mourned its creator. Even the soldiers paused, glancing upward as thunder rumbled in the distance. From the cross came a cry, faint yet filled with power. My God, why have you forsaken me?" It was not a cry of despair, but of fulfillment, the prophecy of Psalms, spoken through the voice of the suffering Messiah. His strength was fading, but his purpose was complete. He looked down one final time, at his mother, at his people, at the world he loved so deeply. His lips trembled as he whispered, "It is finished." Then, lifting his eyes to heaven, he breathed his final prayer. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." The world trembled. The earth split. The temple veil tore from top to bottom. The barrier between God and man shattered forever. The sky turned black, though it was still day. Even the Roman centurion, standing guard, fell to his knees and whispered, "Truly, this was the Son of God." The wind carried his last breath across the hill. The cross stood tall, a symbol of suffering turned into glory. Heaven was silent, but salvation had begun. The crucifixion was not the end. It was the beginning of redemption. The king had died, but his kingdom was just awakening. Fade to black. Soft instrumental theme plays. Text appears on screen.